Okay. Good evening. The grand jury for Jackson County today heard from 45 separate witnesses, including witnesses that were suggested by the decedent's family in the case of the Albertson shooting by the federal marshals. After hearing the testimony, they then deliberated for nearly half an hour and came to the determination that the shooting itself was justified. Are there any questions?
How long did it take? You said the hearing itself, was it 30 minutes to deliberate, but how long did the hearing itself take?
The started hearing testimony regarding the shooting, I think, at approximately 9:40 this morning, and deliberated and came to a decision at approximately 9:40 this evening.
Did the federal marshals have any involvement in this?
The federal marshals were all offered the opportunity to testify in grand jury, obviously without the presence of an attorney to be questioned by myself. Each marshal that was involved in the shooting did choose to testify.
Now, will they be named or any other further evidence brought to light that was presented? Any other evidentiary things, photos?
At this point, I need to consult with the Marshals Department regarding their policies and procedures about releasing the names. All the documents in our case will become public record through the public record statute now that the shooting has been found to be justified, and the file forwarded on to the Department of Justice through the Marshal's Service.
Can you tell us how many rounds were fired into the SUV?
Yes. 20 individual rounds were fired that evening. All of them hit the vehicle or an occupant inside the vehicle.
Can you tell us how many hit Georgeson? Or
Yes, 4 rounds hit the decedent.
where did he hit him?
Per the autopsy, there were 2 rounds that hit that were non-lethal rounds to the head, 1 to the head that was potentially lethal, and 1 through the chest into the heart that was potentially lethal.
So I'm sorry, 2 rounds non-lethal to the head, 1 potentially lethal, 1 lethal to the chest.
Yes. The round to the chest would have been lethal. The round to the head would have been lethal.
And who were the other, you mentioned the 2 officers did testify. Who were were some of the other witnesses that testified, people that saw the shooting and saw it happen?
We called 39 separate witnesses apart from officers involved, I believe. Everyone, I believe, that was requested by the decedent's family to testify. People who are inside the store, outside the store, in the parking lot, in vehicles, behind vehicles, heard what happened and saw what happened.
Including Mr. Georgeson's mother and stepfather, they were also witnesses?
That is correct. They were allowed to testify at grand jury, although they were not present at the time of the shooting.
Is that common for family members to be able to testify even if they're not there when the incident happened?
To my knowledge, it's the first time that that's been done in an officer-involved shooting.
And how come that was done in this case?
At the request of the family's attorney, they were allowed to testify.
Who is the family's attorney?
I don't know if they've released any details of their legal representation. I haven't been in contact with him about releasing their name. As far as I know, no lawsuits or litigation has been instituted.
The 2 individuals that were in the SUV at the time, were they named?
The 2 individuals that are in the SUV along with the decedent, Jimmy Georgeson, are juveniles. I will not be releasing their names.
Did they testify today?
Yes, they were both allowed to testify today and did in fact testify.
Is 30 minutes a pretty standard deliberation time? Would you consider that long in your experience? Short?
I've taken murder cases through grand jury and other complex cases. Given the nature of today's testimony, which spanned nearly 12 hours, I don't think it was particularly long or short, but appropriate for the situation.
And you mentioned that was the Georgeson family able to request certain people to testify?
It was made clear to the family at the outset if they felt there were material witnesses that needed to be questioned by law enforcement, that we would make every effort to question those potential witnesses.
I mean, I don't know if you can say or not, but was this a surprise to you? I mean, was this a surprise to the people involved in this case, or like the outcome of the grand, like what the grand jury voted? I mean, was the family and everyone surprised by this?
I can't speak for the family. I can say that a thorough investigation was done into this shooting. It was taken extremely seriously. That an Oregon State Police specialist spent time going through total station and all the statements to produce a 3D reenactment for the grand jury to view regarding the positions of all the officers involved in this particular shooting. In addition, that the criminalists from the Oregon State Police spent tens and tens of hours doing a PowerPoint presentation and going over the physical evidence to make sure that every round was accounted for. 20 rounds were expended and 20 entries are accounted for in the vehicle. There was no random spraying of bullets, and the bullets that went and hit either the store or other cars were bullets that had been shot at the driver of the vehicle.
So then those two marshals are cleared of any wrongdoing, any would-be charges or indictments. Is that the end of it in terms of recourse for the family?
That is the end of the grand jury investigation into whether it was a justified shooting and state criminal charges. The Jackson County District Attorney's Office represents the state of Oregon only.
And so you just mentioned there was a 3D reenactment of what had happened.
That's correct.
And that was shown. The grand jury saw that 3D reenactment.
Yes, several times.
And is that? I mean, I've never heard of anything like that. Is that something that's typically done, like a 3D reenactment?
We were very fortunate to have the person from the Oregon State Police who had done the 3D reenactment of, I believe, an aggravated murder either last year or the year prior in Klamath County. So that person was had experience in taking these multiple shooting situations or situations where there might be one shooter and then showing for a finder of fact what the positions of the various shooters would have been. The criminalist, Jeff Dosey, for the Oregon State Police, did an excellent job in determining, based on his calculations and the videos from Albertsons, where each shot was in fact taken and where it entered into the vehicle.
And are the videos of Albertsons of the incident, will those be made public or no?
At the request of the family, I will be going over the materials that were presented to me during the course of the investigation with representatives of the family prior to disclosing them to the public. The things that are public records will be made public.
That includes the Albertson surveillance video and the 3D reenactment?
The 3D reenactment and the PowerPoint presentation were produced by the Oregon State Police. They need to be peer-reviewed, I believe, before they can be released to the public. They have high standards at the Oregon State Police Crime Lab as to what they release in public, and I believe that the criminalist has to have his information cross-checked and reviewed by other peers before that will be released to the public.
Was the car completely stopped when they fired the shots into it, or was he driving? Was the car moving as they were firing on the car?
From what was provided to the grand jury for their consideration regarding the video surveillance, the testimony of the marshals, and the 3D reenactment, as well as the PowerPoint, the car is moving when the shots are fired. It crashes. The first shot apparently would have been fired after it crashed into a pillar, and there was a marshal to the front of the car as the car is driving off. The second shot would have been fired after it crashed into another marshal's car head-on later in the parking lot. Other shots were then fired as the car is backing up, crashing into another marshal's car. And then shots, I think, are being fired as it's continuing to go to reverse and hitting another car. There were several cars that were run into by the decedent.
Were any of them cars of people that were just shopping there, just bystanders, or was it just marshals' cars?
There were, the marshals are obviously in the cars that are being driven by marshals that were run into. There were cars that were run into that I believe were unoccupied at the time. However, there were people in their cars around the crash sites throughout the parking lot. There are people who were outside of the cars, around the cars, near the crash sites. There were people near the pillar. There were people near the entrance to the store. There were people who were ducking under cars. It's a parking lot with people at approximately 5:20 on a Thursday afternoon.
So again, David, so Georgeson's car had actually struck the marshal's car and then the shots were fired?
Georgeson's car initially struck a pillar as it went into reverse, hitting the store. Both of the marshals had exited their vehicle, were out with guns drawn. As Georgeson then floored it and came what he perceived to be towards or in his direction, one of the marshals did in fact take that first shot. He saw it, and according to the PowerPoint and testimony, actually hit the vehicle. It did not hit the decedent, Mr. Georgeson. After that occurred, it then ran into the other deputy marshal's vehicle, moving it a great distance. And after that occurred, it backed up, and by this time, the first marshal's vehicle is following along in the parking aisle and crashes into that vehicle, causing both vehicles to move. Then it continues to go in reverse and hits another vehicle. In between that time, it may have hit directly or swiped other vehicles.
During the testimony, were there any conflicting accounts of how witnesses saw it, and if so, how many witnesses saw it differently?
There were tens of witnesses who testified as to what they perceived. People would testify as to the positions, when they thought shots were fired, what they heard, what they didn't hear. People may watch an event, two separate people may watch the same event and perceive it differently. There was lots of testimony as to what people perceived that was not necessarily in accord with either the shell casings that were found or the videos that were played.
How long did this whole, on the tape, how long did the whole thing last? You know, from the first shots to the Georgeson being shot?
I think it's fair to say this lasted less than 30 seconds or so, the main part of what occurred. Definitely less than a minute. When you say the whole thing, there are three separate episodes really involving the front of the store, that initial running into a pillar, the running into the marshal's car, the backing into the marshal's car, and then from the backing into the marshal's car, backing into a different vehicle. And during this time, shots are being fired at different locations. What we can tell you is based on the evidence that was presented to us that these shots were entirely directed at the driver of the vehicle that no one else was hit or hurt, that the two juveniles who were in the back seat were pretty much on the floorboard for almost all of the shooting, and that they were unharmed from the shooting.
Is it clear on the tape how it all started? Like, did the marshal approach Georgeson when he was in his vehicle, or was he out of the vehicle, or did it start when he was in the vehicle?
It's clear from the videotape and the testimony that the marshals came in hoping to pin Mr. Georgeson towards the front of the store. Their initial plan, I believe, was to actually get him in a parking space away from the store. That did not happen because he moved. To then follow up, they went ahead and tried to pin him at the front of the store. There was a delay in one of the marshals' vehicles being able to get to the front of the store because another person was pulling out from their parking space at the same time.
So he was walking out of the store?
No, he was never walking during this incident.
Okay.
Mr. Georgeson was in a Durango driving, doing what could be termed counter-surveillance throughout the parking lot to see whether or not there were people there who were trying to apprehend him. At a certain point, he goes to meet someone at the front of the store, is stopped at the front of the store, and the marshals drive down trying to pin him in. As they come, the lights are activated. The marshals both exit their vehicle at approximately the same time. They are wearing vests marked, showing them to be police officers, tactical vests. Commands are given to the effect of get out of the vehicle. They have their guns drawn. Mr. Georgeson at that point decides to back into the pillar without looking to see whether there are anybody around, hits at a high rate of speed so that it raises up and then floors it coming out of the pillar in the direction of a marshal. The marshal's able to get out of the way from what he perceives to be the threat, and that is when the first shot is fired during this encounter.
When this incident first happened, I think there were questions on whether, why an Albertsons was chosen. I mean, did the marshals mention at all during their testimonies why they just didn't let him go? I mean, if the original plan didn't work, why they just didn't, let him drive off and pick a different location? Or even if that was possible.
It's not my place to question the tactics that were employed by the marshals during this operation. The question for the grand jury was whether or not the shooting was justified. It's based on Oregon law concerning the use of deadly physical force for peace officers acting in the line and course of duty. As to their judgment regarding the tactics that were employed, the operation that was utilized, the time of day, that is not what was before the grand jury.
Can you speak to whether or not when the marshals will go back to work, or is that something you have to ask?
You'd have to ask the Marshal Service. And are you assuming that they're not at work right now?
Well, we had been told that they were on paid administrative leave, I believe, and I didn't know if that still.
All of the marshals that were involved?
I don't know if all of them. I know.
I'm not in a position to answer your question.
How many marshals in total were involved?
3 marshals were involved. I honestly believe that those names will probably be released by the Marshal Service, given that this investigation has concluded at the state level.
Was it 3 marshals and then 2 marshals shot or fired shots, or did all 3?
2 marshals fired shots.
I'm sorry.
Take your time.
So for the surveillance video, any idea of if and when anyone would be able to get a hold of it?
Yes, I would like to release all the documents that I think would become public, especially the surveillance video and the 911 call, at the earliest possible time. I have respect for the family who I informed before coming here tonight. I would like to sit down with them and go over what has occurred first.
Did the marshals try to administer life-saving aid to him after the shooting? They pulled him out of the SUV?
The testimony was such that they went and made a determination of whether or not the perceived threat had ended. They believed that he was incapacitated. At the same point, they thought there may or may not have been life still there. They're checking for a pulse. They find that there's no pulse. When paramedics do arrive on the scene, they then take him out of the vehicle and try resuscitation efforts. He had already received 2 lethal wounds, one to the aorta, one to the head. Their efforts were unsuccessful.
So is it believed that he was already dead when the paramedics got there?
That's probably a valid conclusion. Any other questions? Good night.